For 3 years, the German Air Force owned the skies over Europe. Not partially, not in certain conditions, or at certain altitudes, or against certain opponents. Comprehensively. The Luftwaffe that swept across Poland in September 1939, and France in May 1940, and Britain in the summer of 1940, was the most experienced, most capable, tactical air force in the world. Its pilots had been flying combat missions since Spain in 1936. Its doctrine had been tested and refined in campaigns that lasted weeks rather than years. Its fighters, the Messerschmitt B F-109, the Focke-Wulf 190, were among the finest aircraft of their generation. 3 years of continuous combat had produced a corps of German fighter pilots whose kill records stagger the imagination even today. Erich Hartmann, Gerhard Barkhorn, Günther Rall, men who shot down hundreds of Allied aircraft and kept flying, men who understood aerial combat at a level that no amount of training without combat experience can replicate. And then the Americans brought a fighter to Europe that none of it could stop. Not because German pilots suddenly forgot how to fly, not because the Focke-Wulf 190 stopped being a formidable aircraft, but because the P-51 Mustang did something that the entire German air defense strategy was built around the assumption that no Allied fighter could do. It flew all the way to Berlin and back. When German soldiers on the ground looked up at the skies over the Reich in the winter and spring of 1944 and saw American fighters at ranges where American fighters had never appeared before, at distances from England that the calculations said were impossible, they understood something that their commanders in Berlin were not yet ready to admit. It was over. To understand what the P-51 Mustang meant to the German war effort, you need to understand what was happening in the skies over Germany before it arrived. The American strategic bombing campaign against Germany began in earnest in 1942 and accelerated through 1943. The theory behind it was straightforward. Destroy Germany's industrial capacity, its oil refineries, its aircraft factories, its ball-bearing plants, and the German war machine would grind to a halt regardless of what happened on the ground. The theory was correct. The execution was catastrophic. The problem was simple and brutal. American heavy bombers, the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator, could reach deep into Germany. The fighters that were supposed to protect them could not. The P-47 Thunderbolt and the Spitfire that escorted the bombers had a combat radius that ran out somewhere over the German border. Beyond that point, the bombers flew alone. The German fighter pilots knew exactly where that point was. They tracked it with precision. They waited beyond it, in the airspace where the escorts had to turn back, and then they attacked. Not in ones and twos, but in organized formations, using the tactical doctrine that 3 years of combat had refined to a lethal art form. The results were catastrophic for the American bombing campaign. The Schweinfurt raids of 1943, attacks on the ball-bearing factories that German industry depended on, cost the 8th Air Force 60 bombers in a single day on the second raid in October. 600 men, gone, in one mission, over targets that still needed to be hit again, because one raid could not destroy what months of production had built. The mathematics of the situation were not favorable to the continuation of the bombing campaign. You cannot sustain losses of that scale indefinitely. The replacement rate, the ability to produce new bombers and train new crews, was extraordinary by any previous standard of industrial warfare. But even American industrial capacity has limits when measured against losses of that magnitude. The German air defense strategy was working. Not perfectly, not without cost. German pilots were dying too, and German pilot training by 1943 was producing men with far less experience than the veterans they were replacing, but working well enough to make deep penetration bombing of Germany unsustainably expensive. The solution existed. It had existed since 1942 in the form of a design collaboration between North American aviation and British requirements that produced an airframe of exceptional aerodynamic efficiency. What it needed was an engine that could translate that airframe's potential into range. The Merlin engine, the same Rolls-Royce power plant that made the Spitfire legendary, provided it. The P-51 Mustang with the Merlin engine and external drop tanks had a combat radius of approximately 475 to 550 miles. Berlin is roughly 575 miles from the English airfields the 8th Air Force operated from. With careful fuel management and the drop tanks that extended its range, the Mustang could escort bombers to Berlin and fight its way back. The total round-trip distance, approximately 1,150 miles, was within its capability in a way that no previous Allied fighter had achieved. The math was simple. The implications were devastating. The first P-51 escort missions over Germany began in late 1943. By January 1944, they were reaching targets that the German air defense system had considered permanently safe from fighter escort. By February 1944, they were over Berlin. Adolf Galland was the general of the fighter arm, the senior Luftwaffe officer responsible for German fighter operations. He was 32 years old, a veteran of Spain and the Battle of Britain, and every major air campaign the Luftwaffe had fought. He was one of the most experienced fighter pilots alive, and he was receiving reports from his pilots in early 1944 that he initially found difficult to accept. American fighters over central Germany. American fighters deeper than American fighters had ever been. American fighters appearing at altitudes and locations that the German intercept system said were impossible given the known combat radius of Allied aircraft. He did not dismiss the reports. He flew missions himself to see what his pilots were seeing. What he saw changed everything. February 1944. Big week. The American 8th Air Force launches a series of massive raids against German aircraft manufacturing facilities, the factories producing the fighters that the Luftwaffe needs to defend the Reich. The raids are coordinated, sustained, and escorted by P-51 Mustangs that appear over targets deep in Germany with a persistence that the German intercept system has no answer for. The German soldiers and workers on the ground at the targeted facilities look up and see something that 3 years of the air war has never shown them. American fighters, not at the edges of their range, desperate to turn back. Not the quick, slashing passes of escorts that had to conserve fuel for the return journey. American fighters that are fighting as if fuel is not a consideration, that are pursuing German interceptors into dives and climbs and maneuvers that only pilots confident in their range can afford. The Focke-Wulf 190 pilots, scrambling to intercept the American bombers, find their standard tactical approach disrupted by something they have not encountered before. The P-51s are not flying defensive patterns around the bombers, staying close, conserving fuel, accepting the tactical initiative to the attacker in exchange for staying within escort range. They are hunting, ranging out ahead of the bomber formations, clearing the airspace, going after German fighters before they can reach the bombers they are protecting. It is a fundamental change in the tactical dynamic of the air war over Germany. The German approach, wait for the escorts to turn back, then attack the bombers, no longer works when the escorts do not turn back. Galland receives the after-action reports from Big Week and files his own assessment to Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, Hitler's designated successor, the man responsible for the air defense of the Reich. The assessment is professional, precise, and deeply unwelcome. He writes that the American fighters, appearing over central Germany, are a new type, the P-51 Mustang, with a combat radius that fundamentally changes the strategic situation. He writes that the German air defense system, built around the assumption that American fighters cannot escort bombers beyond a certain range, requires complete reassessment. He writes that without a credible answer to the P-51, the American bombing campaign will be able to target any facility in Germany without effective fighter opposition. Göring's response is one of the most documented moments of institutional denial in the history of the Second World War. He refuses to believe it. He tells Galland that his pilots are mistaken, that what they are seeing cannot be P-51s because no Allied fighter can fly that far into Germany. He tells Galland that his pilots are either cowards making excuses for poor performance or incompetents who cannot correctly identify the aircraft they are fighting. Galland responds with the directness of a man who has flown the missions himself and knows what he saw. He tells Göring, in a meeting that other Luftwaffe officers present, later documented in their memoirs, that he has personally engaged American fighters over central Germany, that they are P-51 Mustangs, that they can fly as far as the pilots say they can, and that if Göring wants confirmation, he is welcome to get into a cockpit and fly a mission himself. The exchange becomes legendary within the Luftwaffe, not because it changes anything. Göring does not get into a cockpit, does not change the assessment, does not authorize the strategic response that Galland is requesting, but because it captures in a single documented confrontation the gap between the institutional reality that German air power leadership is trying to maintain and the operational reality that German pilots are living every day over the Reich. On the ground, German soldiers, watching the air battles over their cities and factories and refineries, are drawing their own conclusions from what they can see with their own eyes. The American fighters are not turning back. The sentiments recorded in German letters, diaries, and prisoner interrogations from this period are consistent and striking. German soldiers and workers near targeted facilities describe watching American fighters operate at ranges and with an aggression that contradicted everything they understood about the limits of Allied air power. Luftwaffe pilots captured and interrogated by Allied intelligence in the spring of 1944 described the appearance of P-51 escorts over central Germany as a psychological as much as a tactical shock. Not just a new aircraft to be countered, but a signal that the strategic assumptions underpinning German air defense had been invalidated. One theme appears repeatedly in these documented accounts. The escorts do not leave. The point beyond which Allied fighters had always turned back, the invisible line that German intercept doctrine was built around, no longer exists, and the pilots scrambling to intercept the bombers know, from the moment they make visual contact with the American fighters, that they are fighting a different kind of war than they were fighting 6 months ago. Galland continues filing his assessments. He requests priority allocation of the new jet fighter, the Me-262, that German engineering has produced and that represents the one technological response to the P-51 that might restore some balance. He argues with Göring. He argues with Hitler, who has decided the Me-262 should be a bomber, not a fighter. He argues with an institutional system that has invested 3 years in a strategic concept that the P-51 has made obsolete in a matter of months. He loses the arguments. The Me-262 is produced too slowly and deployed too late to change the strategic situation. The P-51 continues its work. By the summer of 1944, the American bombing campaign is reaching targets that were effectively unreachable in 1943. The oil refineries at Ploiești in Romania, the synthetic oil plants that German armor and aircraft depend on, the transportation infrastructure that moves fuel and supplies to every front. One by one, the targets that the German war economy cannot function without are being hit and hit again by bombers that arrive with escorts that the German air defense system cannot effectively counter. The German soldiers on the ground watching this understand what is happening before the official narrative acknowledges it. They see the contrails. They count the German interceptors that scramble and the ones that come back. They watch the bombs fall on the factories and the refineries and the marshalling yards. They read the faces of the Luftwaffe pilots at the airfields near their positions, men who were confident 3 years ago, who are something different now. The documented accounts from Luftwaffe pilots interrogated by Allied intelligence in the summer and autumn of 1944 describe a consistent psychological shift within German fighter units. Not a collapse of individual courage. German pilots continued flying and fighting until the final weeks of the war with a tenacity that their opponents consistently acknowledged. But a shift in what the fighting meant. A recognition, expressed in the private channels, that military institutions create for honest assessment rather than official reporting, that the strategic situation had moved beyond what tactical excellence could address. The P-51 had done this, not in a single dramatic battle, but in the cumulative weight of mission after mission. Escorts that ranged where escorts were not supposed to range, fighters that fought where fighters were not supposed to be able to fight. The patient systematic demonstration that the assumptions German air defense had built its strategy on were wrong. That subscribe button is how the next person finds this story. This channel exists for exactly this, the moments that changed the war that nobody put in the textbooks. If this story deserved to be told, take 10 seconds and tell the algorithm you agree. The strategic consequences of the P-51 Mustang's introduction over Germany in early 1944 extended far beyond the air war. The destruction of the Luftwaffe's fighter strength over the Reich in the first half of 1944, what American planners called the Big Week campaign, and the sustained offensive that followed it, removed the air superiority that Germany needed to contest the Normandy landings in June 1944. When Allied troops hit the beaches on June 6th, the Luftwaffe's presence over the invasion area was negligible. While the Luftwaffe flew several hundred sorties across France that day, the number that actually reached the invasion beaches was a handful. Most famously, just 2 Focke-Wulf 19Os, led by Joseph Priller, that made a single strafing pass over the beaches before the weight of Allied air power forced them away. The air umbrella, that should have made an amphibious landing catastrophically expensive, was effectively absent. It was absent because of what happened over Germany in February, March, April, and May 1944. Because P-51s ranged over the Reich, destroying German fighters in the air and on the ground, wearing down the pilot strength and the aircraft inventory that Germany needed for every subsequent campaign. Galland estimated after the war that the sustained American air offensive of early 1944 cost the Luftwaffe approximately 1,000 pilots, not just aircraft, pilots, in a period when German pilot training was already producing replacements with a fraction of the combat experience of the men being lost. The experience gap that had made German fighter pilots so lethal in 1940 and 1941 was being consumed at a rate that German training could not replace. The oil campaign that followed the establishment of air superiority over Germany, the systematic destruction of synthetic oil production and refining capacity, produced fuel shortages that grounded German aircraft, immobilized German armor, and strangled the logistical systems that every German military operation depended on. By late 1944, German pilots were being trained with reduced flight hours because there was not enough fuel to train them properly. German tanks were being abandoned not because they were destroyed, but because they ran out of fuel. German strategic reserves were being hoarded for operations that the fuel situation made increasingly hypothetical. All of it traceable in the chain of strategic causation to the day P-51s appeared over Berlin and German pilots filed reports that their commanders refused to believe. Galland was eventually relieved of his command in January 1945, partly as a consequence of his sustained conflict with Göring over the management of the air war, partly as a scapegoat for the failure of German air defense that his assessments had predicted and his superiors had refused to address. He was replaced by a commander more willing to tell Göring what Göring wanted to hear. By then, it did not matter. The strategic situation that his assessments had described was the reality that Germany was living. Adolf Galland survived the war. He was eventually given command of a unit of Me-262 jet fighters in the final weeks of the conflict. The technological response to the P-51 that he had been requesting for months, arriving too late and in too few numbers to change anything. He flew combat missions in the Me-262 until the end of the war, achieving additional kills in an aircraft that represented what might have been if the institutional decisions had gone differently. After the war, he wrote his memoirs, The First and the Last, a professional account of the Luftwaffe's air war that became one of the most widely read works of military aviation history ever published. In it, he describes the moment the P-51 appeared over Germany with the precision of a man who understood exactly what he was watching and exactly what it meant. He describes the reports from his pilots, the confrontation with Göring, the institutional refusal to accept what the operational evidence was showing, and the knowledge present from the moment he flew his first missions against P-51 escorts, that the German air defense system had no answer for what the Americans had brought to the skies over the Reich. The American pilots who flew those early P-51 escort missions over Germany, the men of the 4th Fighter Group, the 354th Fighter Group, the units that first ranged deep into German airspace, with the confidence that range was no longer a constraint, came home after the war and went back to their lives. They became farmers and mechanics and businessmen and teachers. Most of them did not talk extensively about what they had done. What they had done was change the war. Not with a single dramatic battle. Not with a moment that newspapers could photograph and caption. With the cumulative effect of mission after mission, escort after escort, the patient systematic destruction of German air power over the Reich until the day came when the bombers could fly to any target without effective opposition. The German soldiers who watched from the ground, who looked up at the contrails and saw American fighters ranging far beyond where the escort fighters were supposed to be, drew their conclusions before the official narrative caught up. They wrote their conclusions in letters home, in diaries, in the quiet conversations at Luftwaffe airfields where the pilots said things privately that the official channels would not accommodate. The documented record of what German soldiers and pilots said about the P-51 in the spring and summer of 1944, preserved in prisoner interrogation reports, in captured correspondence, in the post-war memoirs of the men who flew against it, is consistent in a way that individual accounts rarely are. The range, the aggression, the fact that the escorts did not leave, the recognition that something had changed in the air war over Germany that German air defense doctrine had no prepared answer for. The American fighter that could fly to Berlin and back had ended the German air defense strategy that 3 years of war had built. What came after it, the Normandy landings, the oil campaign, the final collapse of German military capacity, followed from that ending with the logic of a strategic sequence that had no other possible conclusion. The P-51 pilots knew what they were doing. The German pilots who met them knew what was happening. The soldiers on the ground who watched the contrails knew what they meant. The official narrative took longer to catch up. It always does. If you felt the weight of this story, that's history doing what it's supposed to do. That like button honors that feeling. Don't skip it. We carry these stories carefully. Every fact verified, every name checked, every detail earned. If that standard matters to you, subscribe and help us maintain it. Where are you watching from? Drop your country below. And if your grandfather flew P-51s or flew against them, if he was part of this story from either side, tell us in the comments. We read everything. Thank you for carrying the weight of these pilots' story forward. The ones who flew to Berlin when Berlin said it was impossible. They bore something heavier than the distance they covered. The least we can do is remember it.